The dawn broke over Dry River not with a gentle blush, but with a hard, brassy glare that bleached the color from the sky. It was a sun that promised heat, not warmth. The wind, a constant resident of the Arizona territory, was already at its work, scraping grains of sand against the raw timber of the saloon and carrying the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush from the surrounding desert. It was a smell of survival, of things that clung to life with deep roots and thorny skin. The only other sounds were the rhythmic creak of the Red Lantern Saloon sign swinging on its iron hinges and the soft, wet scrape of Eliza Hart's brush against the floorboards inside. On her hands and knees, Eliza worked with a grim efficiency that had become second nature. The filth of the previous night's spilled whiskey, tobacco juice, and the mud from a dozen pairs of boots was a debt made visible. Each swill of dirty water, each ache in her back, was a coin paid towards the ledger Silas Crane kept on her family. Her calico dress, patched at the elbows, was damp, and stray strands of her brown hair, escaping her tight bun, clung to her sweaty brow. She was 24, but the harsh sun and the heavier weight of worry had etched fine lines around her eyes that held the guarded, weary look of a creature that had learned to expect the worst. Love, her father had once told her, was a choice you made every day. But Eliza had learned a different lesson in Dry River love was a lie, a weakness that men like Crane exploited until there was nothing left but dust and debt. When the last of the grime was gone, replaced by the damp, clean scent of lye soap, she rose, her knees protesting. Pushing the heavy door open, she stepped onto the covered porch, blinking against the aggressive morning light, and they were waiting. Silas Crane stood in the center of the porch, flanked by two of his black jacks. Crane was a man who wore his wealth like armor, a tailored coat, polished boots, a silver watch chain gleaming against his waistcoat. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, but his smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, punctual as ever, a commendable trait in a debtor. His men, broad-shouldered and dull-eyed, shifted their weight, their presence a silent, brutish threat. They didn't speak, they loomed. Eliza's hand instinctively went to the small, worn scar on her wrist, a nervous habit. She said nothing, merely meeting Crane's gaze. "I was just reviewing your account," Crane continued, tapping the paper. "A fascinating piece of arithmetic. It seems the interest has compounded again. The original loan for your parents' supplies, you see, continues to accrue its own interest. A debt on a debt." He took a step closer, invading her space. "It's becoming quite a mountain, Miss Hart. A mountain I fear you cannot climb by scrubbing floors." Eliza's chin lifted. "The agreement was work until the principal is paid. That's the law." Crane laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "The law in Dry River is a curious thing. It tends to favor those who can afford to interpret it correctly. Your house, for instance, that fine adobe structure your father built with his own hands. It would cover a significant portion of this new total." Before Eliza could form a reply, a sudden thunder of hooves shattered the tense quiet. Dust billowed as a powerful bay horse was reined in sharply, its front hooves dancing just feet from the porch steps. The rider was a tall man, his features obscured for a moment by the shadow of his hat brim. "My apologies, ma'am." The man's voice was a low baritone, calm and steady. He tipped his hat, revealing a sun-weathered face, a square jaw, and clear, direct gray eyes. He looked at Eliza, a flicker of concern in his gaze, before it settled on Crane. This was Cole Mallory, owner of the Mallory Cattle and Freight Company, a man who spoke little but whose presence filled a space far more than Crane's tailored suit ever could. Cole's eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, Crane's predatory stance, the two hulking figures behind him, and the defiant tension in Eliza's shoulders. He didn't need to hear the words to understand the language. He swung a leg over his saddle, dismounting with an easy grace. He didn't move toward them, but his stillness was more potent than any threat. "Crane," he said, his voice even. "Morning." Crane's smile tightened. "Mallory, out for an early ride?" "Checking my freight lines," Cole said, his gaze not leaving Crane. He then looked pointedly at the paper in Crane's hand. "You've always struck me as a man with a healthy respect for two things. Crane, the letter of the law, and accounts significantly larger than your own. I trust you're minding both this morning." The implication hung in the air, sharp and clear. It was a reminder that while Crane might own the town's trust and mercantile, Mallory controlled the flow of goods and money through the territory. He was the bigger predator. Crane's face flushed a dull red. For a moment, the two men locked gazes. A silent battle of wills fought in the dusty morning air. Finally, Crane gave a curt nod. "Just a business matter." He folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "We're finished here. For now." He turned and strode off the porch, his men following like loyal hounds. Cole watched them go before turning his attention back to Eliza. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice softer now. He touched the brim of his hat one more time and, without another word, mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Eliza alone in the silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. He hadn't saved her, not really, but he had given her a shield, however temporary. And for a woman who had learned to trust no one, the gesture was as unsettling as it was welcome. Shaken, Eliza walked the dusty path back to her home at the edge of town. It was a small, square structure, its thick adobe walls offering a cool respite from the growing heat. Her parents had built it themselves, mixing the mud and straw with their own hands, their laughter baked into the very walls. It was all she had left of them, a fortress of memory against a hostile world. Inside, the air was still and smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. This was her sanctuary, the one place Crane's shadow couldn't fully penetrate. But it had. Tacked to her door with a rusty nail was a folded piece of paper. It looked official, stamped with the seal of the territory. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free. Unfolding it, the words leaped out at her. Stark and brutal, emergency foreclosure. The document declared that, due to the untenable and rapidly escalating nature of the Hart debt, the property was to be seized by the Dry River Trust and Mercantile within 48 hours. At the bottom was the hurried, sloppy signature of Judge Pike, a man known to be more fond of Crane's whiskey than he was of justice. The air rushed from her lungs. This wasn't about debt anymore. This was theft, plain and simple, dressed up in the rags of the law. A cold fury, followed by a wave of profound despair, washed over her. She sank onto the worn wooden bench by the door, the paper clutched in her hand. All her work, all her sacrifice, for nothing. The world was exactly as she'd come to believe it was, a rigged game where men like Crane made the rules and men like Pike enforced them. Her parents' faith in hard work and honest dealing was a fool's dream. Her gaze drifted to the small patch of earth beside her porch. It was mostly cracked, dry dirt, like everything else in this God-forsaken territory. But there, pushing up from a barrel cactus, was a single, defiant flower. Its petals were a vibrant, shocking magenta, a splash of impossible color against the endless brown. It had no business blooming here. In this heat, with so little water, it was a stubborn, beautiful, illogical thing. A fool's hope, perhaps. But as she stared at it, a flicker of its own defiance sparked within her. They could sign their false papers and make their threats, but they hadn't broken her yet. That night, sleep offered no escape. The desert outside her window was a vast, silent sea of silver and shadow under a full moon. Eliza sat at her small table, the foreclosure notice laid flat before her, a declaration of war. As the moon climbed higher, a movement in the distance caught her eye. She rose and went to the window, peering out into the stark landscape, A line of riders, perhaps a dozen strong, was moving across the desert floor. They moved with a silent, disciplined purpose that marked them as something other than wandering cowboys or a sheriff's posse. They were shadows on the sand, their forms silhouetted against the distant mesas, their destination unknown. They were a premonition, a quiet ripple in the darkness that promised a coming storm, the trouble in Dry River. Eliza knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone was only just beginning. The night offered no rest, only a series of sharp-edged thoughts and the recurring image of the silent riders in the moonlight. Eliza had sat with her father's old shotgun across her lap until the first pale light seeped through the window, erasing the stars. She hadn't lit a lamp. The darkness felt safer, a cloak in a world where the light only seemed to expose her vulnerabilities. When the sun finally crested the distant mesas, it felt less like a new day and more like the start of a final countdown. 48 hours. The words from Judge Pike's flimsy legal document were branded in her mind. The sound came just as she was forcing down a piece of dry bread, the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel outside, accompanied by the low murmur of male voices. They were here. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot. Placing the shotgun on the table, she walked to the door, her movements deliberate and devoid of haste. She would not show them fear. She would meet them on her own 2 feet, on the ground her parents had claimed and consecrated with their sweat and dreams. Silas Crane was already on her small porch, the foreclosure notice held up like a royal decree. He had brought the same 2 men as before, their expressions a mixture of boredom and brutish anticipation. They stood on either side of him, blocking her path, a human cage. "Good morning, Miss Hart," Crane said with a triumphant smirk. "The clock is ticking. I've come to begin the inventory of my new property. I trust you'll be sensible and not cause a fuss." Eliza's eyes were steady. "This is my property, Mr. Crane, and you are trespassing." Crane chuckled. "Spirit. I almost admire it, but spirit doesn't pay debts, nor does it argue with a judge's signature." He took a step toward the door, intending to push past her. "Now, stand aside." Eliza didn't move. "You'll do no such thing." One of the thugs took a menacing step forward, his hand flexing. "You heard the boss?" The standoff hung in the dry air, brittle and ready to snap. It was 3 against 1, a battle already lost. Eliza's mind raced, searching for an escape that didn't exist. This was it. This was how she lost everything. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice was quiet, yet it cut through the tension like a keen-edged knife. Cole Mallory sat astride his bay horse at the edge of her property, not 20 feet away. He hadn't been there a moment before. He seemed to have materialized from the dust and the morning glare. He wasn't armed, not visibly, but his relaxed posture held a kind of coiled readiness that was more intimidating than any drawn pistol. Crane spun around, his face contorting with fury. "Mallory? This is none of your concern. This is a legal matter between myself and this woman." Cole swung down from his saddle, moving with the same unhurried purpose as the day before. He walked toward the porch, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic jingle. He stopped at the bottom step, his gaze fixed on Crane. "It became my concern about 3 days ago," Cole said, his voice level. He reached into the inner pocket of his duster and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. "I was in Tucson on business. Happened to stop by the Territorial Bank and Trust. I find they hold all sorts of interesting paper." He unfolded the document, including the original promissory note for supplies, signed by John Hart. "Your father," he added, glancing at Eliza. "It seems the bank was happy to sell it. To me." Crane stared at the papers, his face paling. "What trick is this? My claim is with the Dry River Trust." "Your claim," Cole said, taking a deliberate step up onto the porch, forcing Crane to step back, "is based on interest you invented, filed with a judge you own. This," he held up the document, "is the primary note, the root of the tree. According to territorial law, Whoever holds this note holds the debt. The only debt. He looked past Crane to Eliza, his gray eyes holding a quiet reassurance. Which means your notice, Crane, isn't worth the paper it's printed on. It's a fraud. The word hung in the air. Fraud. An accusation that, if proven, could unravel Crane's entire empire of intimidation. The two thugs looked uncertainly from Crane to Mallory, their simple calculus of force suddenly complicated by matters of law they didn't understand. Crane's composure finally cracked. A dark, venomous rage filled his eyes. "You have no right." "I have every right," Cole interrupted, his voice dropping, taking on a hard, metallic edge. "I now own the Hart debt, and I am not foreclosing. Now, I suggest you and your men leave Miss Hart's property. Immediately." For a long moment, Crane stood his ground, his fists clenched. But he was a bully, and bullies thrive on the certainty of their power. That certainty was gone. Cole Mallory hadn't just challenged him. He had dismantled his authority with a piece of paper and a few quiet words. Defeated. Crane turned on his heel. "This isn't over." "Mallory!" he spat, before stalking away, his men trailing behind him like whipped curs. The silence they left behind was vast. Eliza leaned against the doorframe, her legs suddenly weak. The adrenaline that had held her upright drained away, leaving her trembling. She looked at Cole Mallory, who was now calmly folding his document and tucking it back into his coat. He was a stranger, yet he had just fought and won a battle she could never have faced alone. The question was, why? "May I come in, Miss Hart?" he asked. She hesitated for only a second before nodding and stepping aside, holding the door open. Inside, the small, cool space of her home felt like a haven. Cole removed his hat as he entered, a gesture of respect that felt startlingly genuine. He looked around the room, taking in the simple, handmade furniture, the neatly stacked books, the bunches of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. His gaze was observant, not judgmental. "Please sit," she said, her voice a little hoarse. He took the chair she indicated at the small table, placing his hat beside him. Eliza remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest, a defensive posture she couldn't seem to let go of. "Mr. Mallory," she began, "I don't understand. Why would you do this? What do you want from me?" She braced herself for the answer, expecting a proposal that would be just another kind of trap. Cole met her gaze directly. There was no guile in his eyes, only a weary sort of pragmatism. "I want to offer you a job, Miss Hart." The answer was so unexpected she could only stare at him. "A job?" "I have a ranch to run, a freight company, and a sister who needs a companion. I need help. From what I hear, your mother was the best herbalist in this territory, and she taught you everything she knew. My men are always getting banged up. I'd rather pay for your remedies than some sawbones, whiskey-soaked advice." He paused, letting that sink in. "I also hear your father taught you his ledgers. My books are a mess. I need someone with a sharp eye to keep my freight accounts in order. And then there's my sister, Mara. She's 18. She went through something difficult a while back. She doesn't talk much. She needs a steady, quiet presence around, someone other than me or our cook. Rosa, I think you could be that person." He laid out the terms as if it were a simple freight contract. "I'll pay you a fair wage. You work for me for 1 full quarter 3 months. At the end of that time, if you've held up your end of the bargain, I will cancel this note. The debt will be gone. The house remains yours, free and clear. It's a formal employment contract. Nothing more." Eliza listened, her mind whirling. It was an elegant solution, too elegant. Men in her experience, especially powerful men, never offered something for nothing. Her suspicion was a shield she had worn for too long to simply set it aside. "Why me?" she asked, her voice sharp. "There are other women in Dry River." "Maybe so," he admitted, "but none of them are being illegally run out of their home by Silas Crane. I don't like Crane. I don't like how he runs this town, squeezing people until they break. This isn't charity. Miss Hart, it's an investment. I'm investing in someone I think it's capable and who has a reason to want to see Crane have less power in this town. Your success is a loss for him. That's good business. In my book. She walked to the window, her back to him, staring out at the harsh, unforgiving landscape that had been her entire world. He was offering her a way out, a path to freedom, but it meant placing her trust in him. It meant leaving the fortress of her home and entering his domain, becoming dependent on his goodwill. The very thought made her skin crawl. I am not a project to be saved. Mr. Mallory, she said, turning to face him. Her voice was low but firm, each word carefully chosen. And I will not be kept or be the subject of town gossip. I'm not asking you to be, he replied, his expression unchanged. I'm asking you to be an employee. Eliza considered him, really looked at him. There was a stillness about him, a weight of past troubles that she recognized. He wasn't a smiling charmer like Crane. He was something else entirely, a man who measured his words and seemed to mean what he said. Perhaps trust didn't have to be a blind leap. Perhaps it could be a transaction, an agreement with terms. All right, she said slowly. I will accept your offer, on 2 conditions. Cole nodded. Name them. First, the contract must state explicitly that my work is that of a bookkeeper, a healer, and a companion to your sister. My duties are professional. My personal life remains my own. Agreed, he said without hesitation. Second, she took a breath. This house, it stays in my name, from this day forward. It is not leverage. It is not part of the deal. It is mine. The work I do is to pay the debt, not to earn back what is already mine by right. It was a matter of principle, of dignity. It was her declaration that she was not a beggar. A flicker of something respect, understanding passed through Cole's eyes. He stood up, extending his hand across the small table. You have my word, Miss Hart. The house is yours. The job is yours. The choice is yours. She looked at his outstretched hand. It was large, calloused from work, not soft like Crane's. It was a hand that built things, that held reins, that could be steady. After a long moment, she placed her own hand in his. His grip was firm, dry, and brief. It was not a promise of love or a vow of protection. It was a deal, a fair one. And in the harsh, sun-scoured world of Dry River, that was more than enough. It was a start. The journey to the Mallory Ranch was a journey into a different scale of existence. Eliza's adobe home was a solitary anchor in the vast, empty desert. The Triple M, nestled in a wide, water-rich valley, was a territory unto itself. A sprawling main house built of thick timber and river stone stood at its heart, surrounded by a constellation of barns, corrals, a bunkhouse, and a blacksmith's forge that puffed a steady plume of gray smoke into the clear blue sky. The air here was different, thick with the smells of hay, horsehide, hot iron, and the low, constant hum of life and labor. It was an empire built of grit and sweat, and Cole Mallory was its quiet, watchful king. Eliza found her rhythm in the spaces between the ranch's relentless demands. Her days were a braid of disparate tasks, each performed with the meticulous care that was her nature. In the mornings, she sat at a small desk in Cole's office, a room that smelled of leather and old paper. She took his chaotic stacks of receipts, freight manifests, and wage chits and tamed them, her pen scratching softly as she created order from his operational chaos. Cole would sometimes stand in the doorway and watch for a moment, his expression unreadable, before giving a curt nod and disappearing back into the whirlwind of his duties. In the afternoons, she took over a corner of the large kitchen, a space ruled by Rosa Alvarez, the ranch's cook. Rosa was a woman as solid and practical as the cast-iron stove she commanded, her face a map of laugh lines and her tongue sharp but her heart kind. Here. Eliza laid out the herbs she'd brought from her own garden, alongside others she gathered from the valley. She ground yarrow to stop bleeding, steeped willow bark for pain, and mixed comfrey salves for the endless variety of cuts, scrapes, and rope burns the cowboys acquired. The men, initially suspicious of her quiet competence, quickly came to value her skill, preferring her potent poultices to the sting of raw whiskey on a wound. But it was Mara who occupied the most delicate part of her new life. Cole's sister was a wraith, a beautiful, fragile girl of 18, with eyes that seemed to be looking at a world only she could see. Eliza would often find her in the stables, standing beside a magnificent black gelding named Vesper. The horse was a creature of midnight and shadow, but it stood with absolute stillness as Mara brushed its gleaming coat, her movements slow and hypnotic. Sometimes, Mara would stop, her head tilted as if listening. She would wrinkle her nose slightly, and a look of profound, distant terror would cross her face. "Do you smell it?" she'd whisper, her voice thin as cobwebs. "Smoke." There was never any smoke. Eliza learned not to argue, only to speak softly. "The wind is just bringing the dust in." Mara, but it wasn't a memory Mara was fighting. It was a haunting. The phantom scent of a long-ago fire was her constant companion, a ghost that lived in her senses. In these moments, her only solace was the solid, living warmth of Vesper. Her fingers knotted in his dark mane. Eliza saw the horse for what it was, an anchor, just like her own adobe house, a piece of the real world to hold on to when the ghosts grew too loud. Eliza found that her presence, quiet and undemanding, seemed to soothe the girl. She wouldn't press for conversation, but would simply sit nearby, mending a saddle blanket or braiding a new rein, her steady presence a silent offering of companionship. The fragile peace of this new routine was shattered 2 weeks into her employment. It was a hot, still afternoon. Most of the hands were out on the range, pushing a herd of 200 head toward the greener pastures in the North Canyon. Eliza was returning from a line cabin where she had delivered a fever remedy to a sick cowboy, riding a gentle mare and accompanied by a young, freckle-faced hand named Billy. They were cutting across a high ridge that overlooked the canyon when the first shot cracked through the air. It was followed by a volley. Below them, chaos erupted. The cattle, bawling in terror, broke and scattered. A brown tide of panic. Eliza saw them immediately, a half-dozen riders, wearing the black bandanas of the Black Jacks, firing their pistols into the air and at the ground around the Mallory cowboys. They weren't trying to steal the cattle. Not efficiently. They were trying to create mayhem, to injure and to terrorize. It was a message from Silas Crane, written in gunpowder and fear. One of Cole's men went down, his horse stumbling. 3 others were desperately trying to control the stampede. And then Eliza saw Billy, who had been riding ahead of the main group, cut off and pinned down behind a rocky outcrop. 2 of the Black Jacks were bearing down on him, their intentions clear. "Get back to the ranch," she yelled at the hand with her. "Get Cole." But there was no time. The riders were closing in on Billy. There was no time for fear. Fear was a luxury, and her life had stripped her of most of those. Her father had taught her to shoot, not for sport, but for survival. Asterisk aim steady, squeeze slow. Don't think about the man. Think about the target. The rifle she'd been given for protection was in its scabbard on her saddle, with movements made swift by pure adrenaline. She dismounted, pulled the heavy rifle free, and dropped to one knee, using a boulder for cover. She wasn't a gunslinger, and she had no intention of killing anyone. She just needed to make them stop. She lined up her sights on the patch of dirt just in front of the lead rider's horse. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report echoing across the canyon. A plume of dust erupted at the horse's feet. The animal shied violently, nearly unseating its rider. The 2 Black Jacks reined in, startled, searching for the source of the shot. Eliza fired again, this time aiming for a shale rock to the left of the second man. The bullet whined as it ricocheted, the sound unnervingly sharp. It was enough. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by the uncertainty of an unseen shooter. They cursed, fired a few wild shots in her general direction, and then wheeled their horses around, melting back into the rocks to rejoin their fellows. They had delivered their message. In the brief, blessed silence, Billy scrambled from behind his cover, leaped onto his horse, and galloped away. By the time Cole and a dozen armed men arrived, the blackjacks were gone, leaving behind a scattered herd, one injured cowboy, and the lingering smell of cordite. The atmosphere back at the ranch was grim. The injured man would live, his leg broken, but the mood was dark. Eliza, her hand still faintly trembling, found herself the reluctant center of attention. Billy, his face pale with shock, recounted the story to anyone who would listen, his words painting her as some kind of sharpshooting savior. She deflected the praise, uncomfortable with the focus, retreating to the kitchen where Rosa was slamming pots with a controlled fury. "Crane is a snake," Rosa muttered, kneading a mass of dough as if it were Crane's neck. "He can't fight Mallory man to man, so he sends his dogs to nip at his heels. You hear the talk from town. He's got everyone on his payroll or in his debt. The mercantile, the freight office. Folks are saying he's even got Sheriff Ward taking his money." Eliza felt a chill despite the kitchen's heat. This was what Cole had been talking about. Crane wasn't just a predator. He was a poison, seeping into the very foundations of the community. Later that evening, Cole found her on the porch, staring out at the stars that looked so cold and distant. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. The silence was heavy with unspoken things. "You saved Billy's life today," he said finally, his voice low. "You didn't have to do that. You could have run." "There wasn't time to run," she replied simply, not looking at him. "And he was just a boy." "He is," Cole agreed, his voice tight. A muscle worked in his jaw. Eliza could feel the anger rolling off him, but it was a cold, contained rage, directed as much at himself as at Crane. She saw in him the terrible burden of a man who felt responsible for everyone under his protection. A man haunted by every failure, real or imagined. The war, she suspected, had left him with deeper scars than any bullet could. "I need some things from my house," she said, changing the subject, "and some supplies from the mercantile." "No," he said, the word sharp and absolute. "You're not going into town." Eliza turned to face him, stunned by the force of his command. "What do you mean?" "No, I have things I need. I'll have one of the men get them for you. I'm perfectly capable of getting them myself. Mr. Mallory." "After today," he shot back, his voice rising for the first time she'd ever heard. "Crane knows you're with me now. He knows you interfered. Do you think he'll just let that go? Going into town would be walking directly into his web. I won't allow it." The words "I won't allow it" struck a dissonant chord deep inside her. They were the words of a keeper, not an employer. A cold, familiar anger began to replace her shock. "You will not allow it," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Our agreement was for employment. It was a contract, not a surrender. I am not your ward. I am not your prisoner." "This is for your own safety," he countered, taking a step closer, his frustration palpable. "My safety is my own concern," she insisted, standing her ground. "I have been taking care of myself in the shadow of men like Silas Crane my entire life. I will not trade the cage he tried to build for me for a gilded one of your making, no matter how good your intentions." They stood on the dark porch, caught in a new and unexpected conflict. This was not about a trip to town. It was about the fine line between protection and control, between an alliance and ownership. For Cole, it was about a deep-seated fear of failing to protect someone else he cared about. For Eliza, it was about a fundamental refusal to ever again let a man dictate the terms of her life. Cole looked at her, at the fierce, unyielding pride in her eyes, and the anger in his own began to recede, replaced by a grudging understanding. She was right. He had crossed a line. The very line she had drawn so clearly in her own home. He had let his fear and his guilt speak for him. He let out a long breath, the sound of a small defeat. "You're right," he said, his voice returning to its usual quiet register. "I apologize. You are not a prisoner here." He paused, his gaze intense. "But I am not a fool, either. I won't let you go alone. If you must go to town, I will send 2 of my best men with you. They will not leave your side. That is my condition. It is not negotiable." It was a compromise, a concession to both her autonomy and his responsibility. It was a bridge across the chasm that had just opened between them. Eliza considered it, her own anger slowly dissolving. It was a reasonable precaution. It was an act of respect. "Agreed," she said softly. He nodded once. The matter settled. But a new tension now existed between them, a fragile awareness of the boundaries they were both navigating. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the house, leaving Eliza alone with the vast, starry sky and the complicated reality of the bargain she had made. The trip to town was a tense, quiet affair. Eliza rode between 2 of Cole's most trusted men, Sam, a grizzled ex-ranger with watchful eyes, and a younger hand named Luke. The streets of Dry River felt different. The gazes of the townspeople no longer just curious, but tinged with suspicion. Whispers followed them like burrs on a saddle blanket. She saw Silas Crane watching from the window of his mercantile, a satisfied smirk on his face. He didn't need to use force here. His poison was already at work, turning neighbors against each other with rumor and fear. She got what she needed, her head held high, and was glad to leave the stifling atmosphere behind. The real trouble came 3 days later. A section of the trail leading to a vital Mallory freight depot had been washed out by a flash flood, and a wagon carrying mining equipment was stranded. Cole decided to lead a small party himself to clear the debris and secure the wagon, which was parked precariously near the entrance to Scorpion Draw, a narrow box canyon known for rock slides. Sam was tasked with escorting Eliza, who was bringing a crate of medical supplies to restock the depot's emergency kit. The canyon walls squeezed the sky into a thin blue ribbon overhead, and the air grew still and hot. An unnatural quiet settled over them, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Cole, riding at the head of the column with 3 other men, held up a hand, his body tense. "That's when the world exploded." A deafening volley of rifle fire erupted from the cliffs above. Splinters flew from the stranded wagon, and the lead horse screamed and went down. Cole and his men dove for the scant cover offered by the wagon and a cluster of boulders. They were pinned, caught in a perfectly executed trap. Puffs of smoke from at least 8, maybe 10, rifles blossomed along the canyon rim. Further back on the trail, out of the direct line of fire, Sam reacted instantly. "Get down," he yelled, pulling Eliza from her mare and shoving her behind a thicket of mesquite. They got 'em boxed in good. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was strangely clear. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. She peered through the branches, her eyes scanning the cliffs. The ambushers were well hidden, their positions chosen to create a devastating crossfire. Cole and his men were returning fire, but they were shooting blind, their bullets ricocheting uselessly off the vast rock faces. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice low and steady. "They'll be flanked or picked off one by one. There's a game trail about 100 yards back. It leads up to the West Ridge. If we can get up there, we can get behind them." Sam gave her a sharp, appraising look. It was a risky move, but she was right. Staying put was a death sentence. "All right, girl, stay low and move fast. I'll cover you." They scrambled back, the sound of the gunfight echoing in the enclosed space. They found the trail, a steep, treacherous path of loose scree and sharp rock. Every rustle of brush, every dislodged pebble sounded like a cannon shot to Eliza's ears. They climbed, lungs burning, until they crested the ridge. Below them, they could see the entire scene laid out like a map. The ambushers were so focused on the targets in the canyon floor that they hadn't anticipated an attack from their rear. Eliza and Sam dropped to their bellies behind a line of weathered rock. "Just like before," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Make them nervous. Make them move." She raised her rifle, found her breathing, and aimed not at a man, but at a precariously balanced slab of rock just above two of the shooters. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the rock with a sharp crack, sending a shower of stone chips and dust down onto the men below. They yelped in surprise, whirling around. Sam followed her lead, his own shot kicking up dirt near another sniper's nest. The rhythm of the ambush was broken. The attackers, who had felt secure in their dominance, were now exposed and confused. One of them, panicked, yelled to another down the line, "Where'd they come from? Crane said to just pin 'em down." He didn't say nothing about this. The words, carried on the canyon wind, were as clear as a bell, Crane said. The distraction was all Cole needed. Seizing the moment of confusion, he and his men laid down a barrage of suppressive fire, forcing the ambushers to keep their heads down. The fight was no longer a turkey shoot. Their perfect trap had been spoiled. Cursing, the men on the cliffs began to scramble back from the edge, their advantage lost. Within minutes, they had melted back into the wilderness, the sound of their horses fading into the distance. The ride back to the Triple M was grim. Cole had a nasty gash on his forearm where a ricochet had torn through his sleeve, and another man's shoulder was grazed. But they were alive. The incriminating words they had all heard echoed in the heavy silence. They now had proof, however circumstantial, of what they had always known. They were met with a new kind of trouble at the ranch gates. Sheriff Amos Ward was there, a dusty buggy behind him and two nervous-looking deputies at his side. The sheriff, a man whose weary face showed the strain of trying to enforce the law in a lawless town, had the decency to look ashamed. "Cole," he said, avoiding Mallory's hard gaze. "Got an anonymous complaint. Sworn statement says you're harboring stolen goods. Specifically, payroll silver from the Pinyon Mine." Cole's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound. "Payroll silver, Amos. You know as well as I do that Crane handles the Pinyon payroll. This is his doing." "Maybe so," the sheriff sighed, wiping a sleeve across his sweaty brow. "But the complaint was filed according to procedure. I got a warrant from Judge Pike. I have to conduct a search. It was a public humiliation, and it was meant to be." While Cole's men watched with simmering fury, the sheriff and his deputies went through the main barn and the storeroom, their search perfunctory and fruitless. They found nothing, of course. The exercise was designed to plant a seed that Cole Mallory, the powerful rancher, was perhaps not the honest man he appeared to be. It was another of Crane's insidious attacks, chipping away at Cole's reputation, poisoning the well of public opinion. As the sheriff was preparing to leave, empty-handed and apologetic, another wagon appeared on the road, this one moving with a slow, defeated pace of pure exhaustion. It was a battered farm wagon, piled high with a pathetic collection of household goods, a rocking chair, a few crates, a mattress stained with age. A man with slumped shoulders held the reins, his wife sitting beside him with a blank, tear-streaked face, two small children huddled in the back. The man, whose name was Henderson, stopped his team near the gate, his eyes hollowed out by despair. "Found Cole's Mr. Mallory," he said, his voice cracking. "He took it. Crane. He took everything. Showed up this morning with one of Pike's notices. Said we had an hour." Cole's face, already grim, hardened into granite. The conflict had just crossed a terrible new threshold. It had spilled over the boundaries of the Triple M and was now consuming the small, independent people of the valley. This was no longer a feud. It was a war of attrition. Before Cole could even respond, Eliza moved. She walked to the side of the wagon, her face a mask of quiet compassion. "Come inside," she said to Mrs. Henderson, her voice soft but firm. "We have food, and a safe place for the children. She led the stunned woman toward the main house, calling for Rosa. She didn't wait for permission or instruction. She saw a need, and she met it, her actions swift and decisive. She organized a space in a clean, dry section of the barn for the family, found blankets and fresh water, and used her own remedies to treat a cough one of the children had developed. She became the calm, efficient center of this new crisis, a beacon of order in the encroaching chaos. That night, after the Henderson family was settled, Cole found Eliza by the corral, staring at the dark shape of Vesper as he moved restlessly in the enclosure. The weight of the day was heavy on both of them. "They'll keep coming," she said, not looking at him. "He won't stop until he's broken everyone." "I know." Cole's voice was strained. He looked at her, at the strength and resolve that seemed to radiate from her small frame. She had fired a rifle to save his men, faced down the sheriff's sham investigation, and taken in a homeless family without a moment's hesitation. She was no longer just his bookkeeper. She had become the heart of the resistance, and that made her the biggest target of all. "Eliza," he said, his voice dropping, "this has gone too far. Crane wants to destroy me, and he'll use anyone to do it. You need to leave. I can give you enough money to get to San Francisco, or back east. Somewhere he can't find you. Somewhere you'll be safe." She finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. She was silent for a long moment, and he thought she was considering it. When she finally spoke, her voice was devoid of any weakness. "No," she said. "Don't be stubborn," he pressed, his frustration born of fear for her. "There's no honor in staying here to get hurt." "This isn't about honor," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "This is about my home. He came from my home first. I ran from men like him my whole life, moving from one town to the next with my parents. I'm tired of running." She took a step closer, her voice gaining an intensity that startled him. "Look around. Cole, you've given shelter to a family that has nowhere else to go. This isn't just your fight anymore. It stopped being just your fight when Crane put that notice on my door. I'm not running. I'm staying. And I'm seeing this through." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had seen her as someone to protect, a victim he had rescued. But he was wrong. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a soldier who had just reported for duty, a leader who had just claimed her place in the battle line. And in that moment, he knew he was no longer fighting for her, but with her. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The weeks that followed the ambush settled into a tense, watchful rhythm. The Triple M was no longer just a ranch. It had become a sanctuary. Another family, the Sullivans, arrived a few days after the Hendersons, their story a grim echo of the first. Crane was accelerating his campaign, using Judge Pike's pen like a weapon to seize land and water rights, bleeding the valley dry. Eliza organized the new arrivals, turning a large bunkhouse into a makeshift dormitory and schoolroom. The ranch buzzed with a new kind of energy, a community forged in shared adversity. And Eliza, quiet and capable, was its undisputed heart. Cole watched her, a growing sense of awe mixing with the constant, gnawing fear for her safety. The attack, when it came, was not on the trail or in the canyons. It was a violation of the heart of the ranch itself. It came on a moonless, windy night. The desert wind, a restless spirit, howled around the eaves of the house and rattled the windows. Most of the ranch was asleep, exhausted from a long day of reinforcing fences and standing watch. The Henderson and Sullivan families were bedded down in the large, sturdy hay barn, which Eliza and Rosa had helped make as comfortable as a home, believing its thick walls offered the most safety. Eliza was jolted awake by a frantic scream, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable roar of a fire catching dry timber. She was out of her small room in an instant. Through the main house window, she saw it. The hay barn was engulfed in an orange glow, flames licking greedily at its roof, driven by the furious wind. Chaos erupted in the yard. Men poured from the bunkhouse, shouting, their faces stark and horrified in the flickering light. Cole was already there, bellowing orders, organizing a bucket brigade from the main well. But the wind was their enemy, fanning the flames into an inferno, driving the fire with a malevolent will. The main doors of the barn were already a wall of fire. The families were trapped inside. Eliza's blood ran cold. She saw Mr. Henderson's face, a pale mask of terror, appear for a second in a high loft window before being obscured by thick, black smoke. They were going to burn alive. The back wall, she screamed at Cole over the roar. "We have to break through the back wall." But the men were focused on the impossible task of dousing the main blaze. They couldn't hear her. Panic was setting in. There was no time. Her mind, sharpened by a lifetime of survival, raced past the fear. Diversion. She needed to create a diversion, something loud enough to break the spell of the fire and draw the men away from the front. Her eyes darted to the small, locked shed where the ranch tools and supplies were kept. Dynamite. They used it for clearing rock slides. Without a second thought, she ran, grabbing a crowbar from beside the forge. She pried the lock off the shed door with a shriek of protesting metal. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of grease and earth. She found the crate, her hands working quickly, her mind a cold, clear machine. She grabbed a single stick and a short length of fuse. She ran not toward the fire, but away from it, toward a rocky outcrop at the edge of the ranch yard. She knew enough to know that the blast needed to be contained, directed. She jammed the stick into a deep crevice in the rock, facing away from the people and buildings. Her hands shook as she lit the fuse. It sputtered to life. She didn't wait to watch. She turned and ran, diving behind a water trough just as a deafening boom shook the very ground beneath them. The explosion had its intended effect. The men, shocked by the blast, stopped what they were doing, their attention ripped from the fire and drawn to the source of the new danger. It was the opening Eliza needed. The back wall. Now, she yelled, pointing, "Get the axes! The families are in there!" This time, Cole heard her. His head snapped around, his eyes locking with hers. He understood instantly. He relayed the order, and a half-dozen men, their focus renewed, broke from the bucket line and charged toward the rear of the barn with axes and sledgehammers. Eliza ran to join them. The heat was unbearable. They smashed through the thick timber wall, creating a ragged opening. Smoke poured out, thick and choking, one by one. The men pulled the dazed, coughing adults and children out into the night air. Eliza helped Mrs. Henderson, who was clutching her youngest child, stumble away from the inferno. Just as they cleared the opening, a section of the burning roof gave way with a groaning crash. A heavy, flaming beam fell, striking the ground where they had just been. One of its smoldering ends clipped Eliza's shoulder, sending a searing shock of pain through her. She cried out, stumbling to her knees but never letting go of the woman and child she was guiding to safety. By the time the fire was finally contained, reduced to a smoldering, blackened skeleton against the first light of dawn, the toll was clear. The barn was gone, but every man, woman, and child was alive. In the exhausted quiet of the aftermath, Rosa led Eliza into the main house, to a small washroom off the kitchen. The sleeve of her dress was burned away, and a raw, angry red burn covered her shoulder and the top of her back. Rosa gave her a bowl of cool water and a jar of burn salve before being called away to tend to the children. Eliza sat on a small stool, her body trembling with delayed shock and pain. She tried to reach the burn on her back with a wet cloth, but the angle was awkward and every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her. The door creaked open, and Cole stepped in, his face smudged with soot, his eyes filled with a volatile mix of relief and fury. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze falling on her exposed, injured shoulder. Her immediate reaction was one of pure, instinctual shame. She tried to pull the tattered remains of her dress closed, turning away from him. "Don't look," she whispered. Her voice choked, her cheeks flushing with heat that had nothing to do with the fire. Cole stopped where he was, a few feet away. He immediately turned his back to her, giving her the privacy of the small space. His voice, when he spoke, was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the harsh reality of the night. He laced it with a hint of humor, a soft tool to blunt the sharp edge of her fear. "I'll look forever," he said quietly to the wooden wall. "If you tell me it's all right to look, if you let me see the things that scare you so I can help watch over them." His words were not about her body. They were about her burdens, her scars, her fears. It was the most intimate thing anyone had ever said to her. It was a promise, not of passion, but of presence, of guardianship. He was offering to stand watch over her vulnerabilities without ever exploiting them. A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of Crane's hatred, a tiny, fragile seed of trust began to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. He heard the soft hitch in her breath. "I'll send Rosa back in," he said, his voice still low. He started to leave, but paused at the door. He didn't need to see her to know the truth of what he felt. The fight for his land, his legacy, his people, it had all distilled down to this one singular point. Her. Asterisk, I choose her, he thought, the vow forming in his mind with the solid weight of bedrock. Asterisk, whatever comes, I choose this. I choose her, forever. He stepped out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the salve and his promise. Just after sunrise, Sheriff Ward rode in. He looked at the smoking ruins of the barn, at the pale, exhausted faces of the families huddled in blankets, and his own face was a grim mask of self-loathing. He spoke to Cole in a low voice, away from the others. "I can't make an arrest. Cole, you know I can't. Half my deputies are on Crane's payroll. They'd say a lamp was knocked over. They'd lose the evidence. A formal report would be a whitewash." He looked utterly defeated. The law in this town is broken. Then he straightened up, and a different kind of light came into his eyes. "But I'm not just the sheriff. I'm Amos Ward, and I live here. And what I see is a crime not just against you, but against all of us." He looked Cole square in the eye. "Officially, my hands are tied, but unofficially, I'm starting a list of men I can still trust. When the time comes, you won't be standing alone." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving behind a new, dangerous hope. The news of the fire and the near death of 2 families traveled to Dry River faster than a dust devil, and it was a line crossed. Harassing a lone woman was one thing, ambushing a powerful rancher was another, but trying to burn children in their sleep, that was a different kind of evil. The town's quiet. Fearful complicity began to crack. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, refused to shoe a horse for one of the blackjacks. Mrs. Gable, who ran the bakery, told another that she was fresh out of bread, though the smell of fresh loaves filled the street. They were small rebellions, tiny fractures in the dam of fear Crane had so carefully built. The town wasn't ready to fight, not yet, but for the first time, it was starting to wake up. The fire changed the wind. For days afterward, a pall of smoke and righteous anger hung over the valley. The unspoken truce of civilization had been broken, and people who had once looked away from Silas Crane's machinations now met his gaze with cold stares. Fear had not vanished, but it was now mixed with a harder, more combustible element, fury. The first crack in Crane's fortress came not as a shout, but as a terrified whisper in the dead of night. A lone rider approached the Triple M, keeping to the shadows, his horse moving at a nervous walk. Sam, standing watch, challenged him with a rifle leveled. The man nearly fell out of his saddle. It was Judge Pike. Brought into the lamp-lit ranch office, Pike was a wreck. His fine coat was stained, his face was slick with sweat, and his hands trembled so violently he could barely hold his hat. He reeked of stale whiskey and sheer terror. "He's insane. Mallory?" Pike stammered, his eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting a bullet to come crashing through. "The fire. He celebrated it, laughed about it, said it was a necessary clearing of the brush. He's talking about making an example of you, of everyone who stands with you. He's bringing in more men, hard men from the mining camps. He's going to burn this whole valley down to get what he wants." Cole stood stone-faced, his arms crossed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Pike, you've been his pet jurist for years." Pike flinched. "Because I have a daughter in Tucson, because I'm a coward, not a monster. I sign his papers. I drink his liquor. But I never signed on for this." He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, shoving it onto the desk. "This is everything. His private accounts, every bribe, every fraudulent foreclosure, every payment to the Black Jacks." His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "It even details how he's been skimming silver from the railroad shipments he's supposed to be guarding, blaming it on bandits. It's all in there. It's enough to see him hang." Eliza, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward. "What do you want in exchange for this?" Pike's pleading eyes fixed on her. "Protection. Get me and my horse to the morning freight wagon heading south. Just get me out of this territory before he knows I'm gone. This book is my life insurance. And yours." It was the turning point. This wasn't just testimony. It was irrefutable proof, written in Crane's own arrogant hand. By dawn, Judge Pike was gone, a ghost on the southern trail, leaving his confession on Cole's desk. Crane must have sensed the shift in the wind, the subtle change in his power. He acted swiftly. Hand-printed notices appeared all over Dry River, nailed to the doors of the saloon, the Mercantile. In the sheriff's office, an emergency town meeting was to be held in the Red Lantern that evening. The topic to address the recent unlawful unrest and restore order. The saloon was packed, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and simmering tension. Crane stood on a makeshift stage, flanked by 4 of his men, looking every bit the concerned civic leader. He spoke in a smooth, reasonable tone, his words carefully chosen to twist the truth. "My friends, our town is in peril," he began, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "We have been a peaceful, law-abiding community, but a shadow has fallen over us. This unrest, these fires. It all began when Mr. Mallory decided to harbor debtors and malcontents at his ranch." He gestured vaguely toward Cole and Eliza, who stood near the back with a handful of their men. "He has created a fortress of defiance, challenging the legal processes of this town. For the safety of all, I propose we grant Sheriff Ward special authority, the power to disarm and disband this private army Mr. Mallory is building, and to restore the sanctity of lawful debt collection." It was a brilliant move, a call for a private, town-sanctioned martial law. With him pulling the strings, murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were scared. Crane was offering them a simple target for their fear. Sheriff Ward, standing near the stage, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Now, Silas, that's not entirely within my—" Before Crane could respond, a clear voice cut through the room. "He's lying!" All heads turned. Eliza Hart had stepped forward. She was not dressed in finery, just a simple, clean calico dress. But she stood with a straight-backed dignity that commanded attention. She was no longer the shamed woman scrubbing the floor of this very saloon. She was a force in her own right. "Mr. Crane speaks of lawful debt collection," Eliza said, her voice steady and carrying to every corner of the room. "Let me tell you about his law. He tried to seize my home with a fraudulent document signed by a judge he owned. He burned the Hendersons' barn and the Sullivans' hayrick, leaving them with nothing." She pointed toward the 2 families, who stood pale-faced in the crowd. "Look at them. Are these the malcontents you fear?" Crane's face darkened. "This is the hysterical rambling of a woman under Mallory's sway." "I am under no one's sway," Eliza retorted, her eyes flashing. "I am a woman who knows how to read a ledger. A ledger that details every acre you've stolen. Mr. Crane. Every bribe you've paid, every shipment of railroad silver you've pocketed. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was a direct, deadly accusation. Lies, Crane roared. She has no proof. Don't I? Eliza's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of her neighbors. Gus, he threatened to foreclose on your forge if you didn't overcharge the army for repair work. Mrs. Gable, he holds the note on your bakery, doesn't he? How many of you live in fear of his ledgers? This isn't about order. This is about one man owning every single one of us. The heat in the room was becoming stifling. It was in that moment that Mara, standing beside Cole, stiffened. Her eyes widened, a familiar, haunted look clouding her features. She brought a hand to her nose, her breath catching. The smell, the crush of bodies, the heat from the oil lamps, the thick, unmoving air. It was coalescing in her mind, twisting into the phantom scent of smoke, of burning hay and terror. Cole saw it and put a steadying hand on her arm. Eliza saw it, too. A flicker of deep concern crossing her face, even as she held Crane in her verbal crosshairs. For a moment, Mara's world threatened to dissolve into the remembered inferno. She swayed, her knuckles white where she gripped the fabric of her dress. But then her eyes found Eliza, standing firm and fearless against the town's tyrant. She saw Cole, his hand on her arm, a silent, solid anchor. She took a ragged breath, then another. She did not scream, she did not run. She squared her shoulders and held her ground, her gaze clearing. The ghost was still there, but for the first time, she was stronger than the ghost. It was a quiet, monumental victory. Eliza's words had broken the spell. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his voice shaking but clear. She's telling the truth. He burned us out. Then another man, a small rancher named Peterson, spoke up. My water rights are next on his list. We all know it. The tide was turning. The fear of Crane was being replaced by the greater fear of a future under his absolute rule. Crane saw he was losing control. His face was a mask of fury. This meeting is over, he yelled. This town will have order. He stormed off the stage, his men clearing a path through the suddenly hostile crowd. The meeting broke apart, not in consensus but in factions. The lines had been drawn. The days that followed were a blur of escalating preparations. The Triple M became the nerve center of the growing resistance. Peterson and 2 other small ranchers rode in, pledging their men and rifles to Cole's cause. We sink or swim together now. Mallory, Peterson said, shaking his hand. More surprisingly, a man named Jonas Reed showed up at the ranch gates. He was one of the gunmen from the Kenyon ambush, a man with haunted eyes and a conscience that had finally gotten the better of him. I never signed on to burn out families, he told Cole, throwing his gun belt on the ground. Crane's paying in silver he's stealing from the railroad. He's promised his new men a bonus from it when they take this place. They're planning to hit you hard. And soon. Even more support came from an unexpected quarter. A rider from the Black Horse trading clan, a group of Yavapai who traded across the territory, arrived with a message for Eliza. Her mother had often treated their people, trading herbs and remedies, and they had not forgotten. The rider brought news Crane had a wagon load of repeating rifles and ammunition coming in on the freight trail from the east, due in 2 days. It was vital intelligence that could tip the coming battle. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, Eliza stood with Cole in the ranch yard. The large iron bell, the one rung in alarm on the night of the fire, hung silent on its post. It had been a symbol of terror, of a violation, but now it felt different. It was waiting. It's coming, isn't it? Eliza said softly. Yes, Cole answered, his gaze distant. He won't stop, not now. She looked at the bell. When the time comes, we should ring it. He looked at her, understanding her meaning completely, not as a warning this time. No, she agreed, a new, hard certainty in her voice, as a summons, a call to everyone in this valley to make their stand. The bell, once a harbinger of danger, had been transformed. It was now the symbol of their union, a promise of a reckoning that would either save Dry River or see it burn to the ground. The intelligence from Jonas Reed and the Black Horse traders gave them a 2-day window. They used every second of it. Cole turned the Triple M into a defensible fortress, barricading windows, setting up firing positions in the hayloft of the remaining barn, and positioning a small, determined force of ranchers and loyal hands. Eliza worked tirelessly, preparing bandages, distributing water, and ensuring the women and children were secured in the stone-walled root cellar, the safest place on the ranch. A grim, focused unity settled over them. They were ready. They were not ready for the cannon. It arrived a full day early, at high noon, when the sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. Crane hadn't waited for his wagon of repeating rifles. Instead, he had ridden to the Peyton mine and used his stolen silver to hire a small army of mercenaries, hard, rootless men with no stake in the valley beyond their pay. And with them, they brought a small, wheeled field gun, a relic of the war that was deadly accurate against timber and adobe. The first shot was not a warning. It was a declaration of annihilation. A cannonball screamed across the yard and smashed into the corner of the main house, obliterating a section of the porch and shaking the very foundations. The second shot tore through the bunkhouse wall, turning wood into a deadly spray of splinters. Cole's men, pinned down before the battle had even properly begun, returned fire. But their rifle shots were like gnats against the cannon's roar. From a slit in a barricaded window, Cole saw Crane, mounted on a fine black horse behind the cannon crew, directing their fire with a cold, triumphant fury. He was not just seizing a ranch, he was erasing it from the earth. Inside the main house, the concussion of each blast vibrated through the floorboards. In the cellar, the children were crying, their fear a palpable thing in the cramped darkness. Eliza, crouched with Mara and the other women, knew with a terrible certainty that they could not win this fight. They could not trade rifle fire with artillery. The adobe walls, their symbol of strength and endurance, were being pulverized. They would all be buried in the ruins of the home they were trying to defend. An idea, born of the same desperate clarity that had struck her during the barn fire, took hold. It was insane. It was almost certainly a death sentence, but it was the only chance they had. She looked at Mara, whose face was pale but whose eyes were clear and steady. The ghost of smoke was absent, banished by the real and present danger. "Stay with them," Eliza said, squeezing the younger girl's hand. "Be strong for them." She found Cole in the chaos of the makeshift command post in his office. "The cannon," she said, her voice cutting through the din. "We have to stop the cannon." "We can't get near it," he yelled back. Reloading his rifle, they're laying down a wall of lead. "Not from the front," she said, grabbing his arm, forcing him to look at her. "The storm cellar connects to an old irrigation ditch. It runs out past the West Corral and into the rocks. It will get us behind them." She saw the question in his eyes and answered it before he could ask. "Dynamite." His face was a mask of conflict. To let her go was unthinkable. To stay here and watch everyone die was impossible. "I'll go," he said. "No," she countered, her voice unyielding. "You have to lead the defense here. If you leave, they'll lose heart. I can do this. Sam will go with me. We know the terrain." Before he could argue further, another cannonball struck the house, and the world dissolved into a cloud of dust and the scream of splintering wood. When it cleared, he looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering resolve in her eyes. It was not the look of a woman asking permission. It was the look of a soldier stating her purpose. He gave a single, agonized nod. As Eliza and Sam slipped into the cool, damp darkness of the cellar tunnel, the wind outside began to howl. The sky, a brilliant, pitiless blue only moments before, was turning a sickly yellow gray. The desert was coming to their aid. a sandstorm, one of the sudden, blinding furies of the territory, was bearing down on the valley. For Crane's mercenaries, the world dissolved. The wind drove sharp grains of sand into their eyes, blurring their targets. Their visibility shrank to a few dozen feet. They were disoriented, their perfect siege descending into a confused, swirling nightmare. But for Cole's defenders, the storm was a cloak. They knew every rock, every trough, every angle of their home ground. The wind muffled the sound of their movements, and the dust hid their positions. The fight began to even out. In the cellar, Mara listened to the muffled sounds of the battle above, the roar of the wind now joining the deadly chorus. She felt the old fear, the phantom sensation of choking smoke, rising in her throat. She closed her eyes, and for a second, she was back in the burning stable, a helpless child trapped by the flames. But then, she saw Eliza's face in her mind's eye, felt her brother's hand on her arm at the town meeting. She was not that child anymore. With a resolve that came from some deep, untapped well of courage, she stood up. She pushed past the other women and climbed the cellar stairs. She emerged into the main house, into a world of dust and chaos. She ran, heedless of the danger, out into the maelstrom of the yard. The wind tore at her hair and clothes, the sand stinging her face. She ran toward the iron bell. Her hands were shaking, not just from fear, but from a profound, transformative purpose. She grabbed the thick rope. She pulled. The first clang was swallowed by the storm, but she pulled again and again, putting all of her strength, all of her fear, all of her hope into it. The deep, resonant toll of the bell began to cut through the howl of the wind and the crack of rifles. It was no longer a sound of alarm. It was a summons. It was the valley's heartbeat, defiant and unbroken. Miles away, the scattered ranchers and Sheriff Ward's posse heard it. They spurred their horses, riding into the teeth of the storm, toward the sound, toward the fight. Eliza and Sam emerged from the irrigation ditch into a world of roiling brown dust. The storm gave them perfect cover. They crept through the rocks, circling behind Crane's forces. They could see the cannon crew, shadows in the gloom, struggling to aim their weapon in the blinding wind. Crane was beside them, screaming orders that were ripped away by the gale. Eliza clutched the bundle she had made 3 sticks of dynamite. Fuses cut short. This was not like before. She couldn't just create a diversion. This had to be a killing blow. "I have to get closer," she breathed to Sam. "It's suicide," he whispered back, his face grim. "It's our only chance," she replied. She moved, a ghost in the storm, from one rock to the next, until she was terrifyingly close, no more than 50 feet from the cannon. She could see the faces of the men, their eyes red and watering from the sand. She braced herself behind a large boulder, struck a match, and shielded the tiny flame with her body. The fuse caught. It hissed. She had seconds. She rose, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, she was exposed. One of the mercenaries saw her, his mouth opening in a shout that was lost to the wind. She drew her arm back and threw the sputtering bundle with all her might. It arced through the dusty air, a small, dark promise of destruction, and landed directly beneath the cannon's carriage. She was already diving back behind the rock when it detonated. The explosion was a physical blow, a punch of pure force that threw her against the boulder. The world went white and silent. When her senses returned, the cannon was gone, replaced by a tangle of splintered wood and twisted metal. The crew had been thrown like dolls. Crane had been blown clear off his horse and lay in a heap on the ground. The mercenaries, their primary weapon destroyed and their leader down, broke. The organized siege dissolved into individual pockets of panicked men firing blindly into the storm. It was then that Ward's posse and the ranchers slammed into their flank. The surprise was total. Jonas Reed, riding with the sheriff, saw one of Crane's men take aim at a young rancher. Reed's pistol was out in a flash, his shot not aimed at the man, but at the rock beside his head. The gunman flinched, dropping his rifle. and threw his hands in the air. All around the yard, men were surrendering, their will to fight shattered. Cole fought his way through the dwindling chaos toward the wreckage of the cannon. He saw Crane staggering to his feet, his face a mask of blood and disbelief. Crane drew his pistol, his eyes wild with hate. Cole lunged, tackling him to the ground. The two men rolled in the dirt. A brutal, desperate struggle. But Crane's power was broken, his body weakened by the blast. Cole subdued him, wrenching the pistol from his hand and binding his wrists with a length of rope. The sandstorm began to subside as quickly as it had arrived, the wind softening, the dust settling. The aftermath was a scene of stark devastation, but they had held. They had won. Eliza walked toward the captured Silas Crane, her rifle held loosely at her side. She looked down at the man who had tried to ruin her, to burn her out, to kill her and everyone she cared about. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a profound, weary finality. He glared up at her, his face contorted in a sneer of pure venom. "Finish it," he spat. "That's what you want, isn't it?" Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, her voice clear and cold above the moans of the wounded. "What I want is for you to face a jury. What I want is the law you tried to twist for yourself. This doesn't end with a bullet in the dirt. Mr. Crane, it ends with a gavel and a judge." She turned her back on him, the act of final dismissal a few feet away. Sheriff Ward was questioning one of the captured mercenaries, a man eager to save his own skin. "Wasn't the sheriff," the man babbled. "We all knew Ward was clean. The information about your patrols, the freight schedules, it came from a clerk at the bank in Tucson. Crane was paying him off with some of the railroad silver. The man knew everything." The final piece clicked into place. The betrayal had been deeper, and yet more distant than any of them had imagined. It wasn't a neighbor who had sold them out, but a stranger in a distant city, corrupted by greed. The battle was over. The cost was high. But they had stood together, and they were still standing. The dawn that followed the battle was strangely quiet. The sandstorm had scoured the sky clean, leaving it a pale, washed-out blue. The wind was gone, and the only sounds were the weary groans of the wounded, the low murmur of voices, and the rhythmic clang of hammers as men began the arduous task of clearing the wreckage. The fight was over, but the work of healing had just begun. Silas Crane and the 20 mercenaries who had surrendered were held under armed guard in the reinforced blacksmith's forge. By midday, a full detachment of U.S. Marshals rode in, dispatched from Tucson by the railroad company, which had a vested federal interest in their stolen silver, armed with Judge Pike's ledger, the testimony of the captured bank clerk, and the sworn statements of 24 ranchers and townspeople. The marshals formally took Crane into custody as they led him away in irons. His face was a mask of cold, impotent rage. He didn't look at Cole. He looked at Eliza, and his eyes held a look of pure, venomous hatred that promised a vengeance he would never be able to enact. His reign over Dry River was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of a federal lock. The town, awakened from its long slumber of fear, began to rebuild itself from the inside out. They held a new election, and Sheriff Ward was re-elected by a landslide. His authority now backed by a town council of honest, hard-working men like Gus the blacksmith and Peterson the rancher. Their first act was to nullify every one of Judge Pike's foreclosures, restoring the land to its rightful owners. Their second was to create a public water commission, ensuring that the valley's lifeblood could never again be controlled by a single man. The age of monopoly was over. An age of community had begun. The Triple M itself was transformed. The smoking ruin of the hay barn was cleared away, and in its place, the ranchers, working together, raised a new, larger structure. It was not just a barn. It was a community hall, a place for meetings and dances, a symbol of their shared future. The damaged bunkhouse was repaired and converted into a small infirmary and a one-room schoolhouse for the children of the valley. Cole, watching Eliza expertly dress a wound or patiently teach a child their letters, knew this was a legacy far greater than cattle or freight lines. Eliza took over the ranch's ledgers, but her work extended far beyond that. With Cole's blessing, she created a new set of books, not for the ranch, but for the new community fund. Every family contributed what they could, and every expenditure for the clinic or the school was recorded in her clear, precise hand. The ledger left open on a public desk for all to see. It was the antithesis of Crane's secret. Weaponized accounting. It was a ledger of trust. Amidst the rebuilding of structures and laws, lives were also being remade. Mara, who had found her voice in the ringing of the bell, now found her purpose in the soil, on the scorched earth where the barn had burned, where the memories of fire and fear were most potent. She began to cultivate a garden. She turned the ashen dirt, mixing it with fresh soil from the riverbank, her hands finding a steady, healing rhythm in the work. She planted rose bushes, cuttings given to her by Rosa. They were thorny, resilient things, and as the first green shoots began to push their way toward the sun, it felt like a quiet miracle. She was no longer tending a phantom of the past. She was nurturing a living, breathing future. One morning, just before the sun crested the mesas, Cole found Eliza by the corrals. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and sage. The sounds of the waking ranch, a distant rooster crow, the soft nicker of a horse were a peaceful backdrop. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the eastern sky turn from violet to a soft, promising rose. "The last of the freight wagons is being rebuilt," Cole said, his voice a low rumble. "The books are balanced. The children have a teacher." He paused, turning to look at her. The new light softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Everything is in its right place." Almost. Eliza waited, her heart beginning a slow, steady beat against her ribs. "I'm not a man for fancy words." "Eliza," he said, his gaze direct and honest, "I've spent my life building things, fences, barns, a business. It's all I know how to do, but none of it feels whole, not without a partner to build it with." He took a step closer, but did not touch her, respecting the space that had always existed between them. "This contract we have, your 3 months are almost up. The debt is paid 100 times over. You're free to go. You could leave this place, leave all this trouble behind." He let the words hang in the air, a final affirmation of her autonomy, of the choice that had always been hers. "But I'm asking you not to," he continued, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "I'm asking you to stay, to build with me, not as an employee, but as my wife. We can go as slow as you like. We can have this house, or your house, or we can build a new one. All I know is that the future of this ranch, this valley, it doesn't make sense if you're not in the middle of it. With me." It was not a declaration of undying passion or a promise of an easy life. It was something far more real and far more valuable. It was an offering of partnership, a request to share the labor, the burdens, and the joys. It was a proposal built on a foundation of respect, forged in fire and crisis. Eliza looked at his earnest, hopeful face, and she thought of the lonely, frightened woman she had been, a woman who believed love was a lie. She had been wrong. Love wasn't a lie, nor was it a blind, romantic dream. It was a choice. It was the choice to stand your ground when it would be easier to run. It was the choice to trust when your heart was guarded. It was the choice to build, day by day. Something stronger than you could ever build alone. A slow smile touched her lips, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her entire face. "I've always wanted to build a new porch on my adobe," she said softly. "I think it's a 2-person job." It was all the answer he needed. He closed the small distance between them and gently took her hand. His touch was no longer just a handshake sealing a deal, but a quiet promise, a beginning. The sun broke over the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. From the far-off hills, The lonely, haunting cry of a coyote drifted on the morning air, not a sound of menace, but a wild, beautiful song of survival. The future would hold challenges. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving land. But for the first time, the people of Dry River were facing it together. And for Eliza Hart and Cole Mallory, they were facing it hand in hand. Thank you for listening to this story. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please consider giving it a little extra support by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world.